When man invented the spectroscope, he made the greatest stride toward solving the mystery of nature by thus being able to write down her language in letters of light. The effects of motion revealed by the spectroscope show the cumulative history of each separate state of motion written within itself. There should be no difficulty in writing a complete history of states of motion which will lead clearly to the very door of the Holy of Holies. The unseen universe of the first 3 octaves and the greater part of the 4th is clearly written in hydrogen and helium. It is quite clearly recorded in the discharging elements nickel, mercury, and tungsten. It is more clearly recorded in manganese, iron, molybdenum, rhodium, ruthenium, titanium, vanadium, zirconium, and other predominantly male charging elements in which the resistance to integration assists man in writing down their history in the language of light. It will require a volume in itself to rewrite a spectrum analysis of the universal language of light. Suffice it for this volume of first principles merely to suggest perhaps a more logical and workable electromagnetic basis for this physical universe of dimension. As each and every element is not a separate substance, but a variation of the one substance, so it is also not an apparent separate state of motion, but a variation of many states of motion. All of the states of motion which go to make up any element are within that element. Octave waves of low potential, of which the elements are tones, are within octave waves of high potential. Within helium is the history of its growth. Helium is a master tone, and helium itself is therefore devoid of spectrum lines of its own. The 3 red lines of helium are the antecedents of hydrogen in octaves of the unseen universe, and other prominent lines tell the story of the 6 empty spaces which follow hydrogen. Consider the spectrum analysis of iron, for example. One can see at a glance the lines which belong to iron, and those which tell its recent and remote history. More important still, one can tell by their positions whether they represent the relative ability of the iron atom to charge or to discharge. Any other attribute of the states of motion which are assembled into that state of motion which we designate as iron is as clearly recorded in its spectrum as the words on this page. One would have no difficulty whatsoever in recognizing the line of wavelength 7817.2 as belonging to iron, and 7392.3 as recent history, and 6944.8 as extremely remote history. To facilitate the better reading of the language of light, herein follows a partial list of lines whose wavelengths belong to iron or to its immediate midtone associates, and also other lists indicating its recent and its more remote history. And I'm not going to read all these numbers because it wouldn't mean much to you, but there is a list here of the changing of the number that represents that iron in remote history, recent history, and dominant history. The division of the visible spectrum into several thousand lines, each one of which is different in its shade of color and in its plane from every other, and of the invisible spectrum into thousands of other lines, tells in its own convincing manner that this universe of varying motion is a universe of varying pressures. By the visible spectrum we mean that portion of the spectrum which can be detected by the evidence of human sight. Great portions of the heretofore invisible spectrum are now detected by the bolometer and by the photograph negative. Every state of motion is indicated by its own particular color line, exactly as it is indicated by its own degrees of temperature, plane, and pressure. Color is one of the great dimensions by means of which we will be enabled to measure the potential position of states of motion which man will soon need to reproduce for the continuance of his very existence. That's interesting. I'll read that again. Color is one of the great dimensions by means of which we will be enabled to measure the potential position of states of motion which man will soon need to reproduce for the continuance of his very existence. The spectrum begins at the 0 - position of the inertial plane with an absence of color. The beginning of resistance to integration is indicated in both directions by ultraviolet. On the positive side of the wave, as general active pressures increase, the violet merges into an infrared, then quickly into red, orange, and the yellow of north. On the negative side of the wave, as radioactive pressures increase, the ultraviolet merges into violet, then slowly into blue, greenish blue, green, and the yellow of north. Yellow is the meeting point of highest pressures, temperatures, densities, and potentials of the wave. From yellow, the 4++ position in the wave pressure walls are tonally erected back through the color pressure positions to the disappearance of color in the inertial plane. Color, therefore, like temperature, is an indicator of a state of motion and has no existence other than an appearance of existence. As the condition and potential position of all mass can be determined by such dimensions as its plane, pressure, and temperature, so also can its condition be determined by the colors which it is able to generate and radiate. All mass is both generative and radiative. All mass indicates its ability to generate by the color pressures indicated by general active lines on the red side of the spectrum, and its ability to radiate by radioactive lines on the blue side of the spectrum. The preponderance of color lines of a mass is indicative of its potential position in its wave. A preponderance of red or orange indicates that a mass is on the outward journey toward the north, and a preponderance of green or blue indicates that a mass is on the return journey to plane. Charging systems, therefore, are preponderantly recorded in the red end of the spectrum, and discharging systems are preponderantly recorded in the blue end. There are many evidences which seem to contradict this law in the spectrum lines of some of the positive elements, but this contradiction is an illusion, similar to the illusion of perspective, and easily comprehensible. The most outstanding of these apparent contradictions is the characteristic yellow D line of sodium. If sodium were perfectly consistent with the law, its red line should be prominent, and its yellow line weak, instead of which they are the reverse. The explanation is simple. Sodium, 601+, is the first positive tone of the 6th octave. At the 5th octave, the superinhalation of the cycle ends with its maximum of pressure. In sodium, therefore, at the beginning of the superexhalation, the intense accumulated pressures of inhalation cause so great a storm of contraction that sodium registers her overtone in preponderance to her true tone. One may more easily understand this situation by drawing in a full breath, holding it in suspense for a moment, and then releasing it. The pressure at the moment of release is great. A perfect analogy is that of the old-fashioned church organ.